Two ships, 2 years apart, two similar numbers. In 1912, the RMS Titanic sank in the North Atlantic with approximately 1,500 people aboard. It took 2 hours and 40 minutes. The ship broke in half. The wreck sank 12,500 feet to the ocean floor, and the world has never stopped talking about it. In 1914, the RMS Empress of Ireland sank in the St. Lawrence River, near Quebec City, with 1,012 people aboard. It took 14 minutes. The ship tilted onto her side in shallow water. The wreck sits 40 meters from shore, so close you can see it from the road, and the world has almost completely forgotten her. The numbers alone suggest a riddle. How can a worse disaster be less remembered? How can a faster sinking create less cultural impact? How can 1,012 deaths disappear from history while 1,500 deaths become a legend? The answer isn't about what happened to the ships. It's about what happened to the stories. Titanic sailed in 1912 as the largest ship in the world, 882 feet long, 46,000 tons, the epitome of Edwardian luxury and confidence. She was built to prove something, that technology had solved the problem of the sea, that distance had been conquered, that pride and engineering could make a man unsinkable. She sailed for 6 days. On the 7th night, she struck an iceberg at 11:40 p.m. For 2 hours and 40 minutes, she sank, slowly, visibly, with time for prayer and goodbye and final embraces. Empress of Ireland sailed in 1914 as a working ship, 570 feet long, 14,191 tons, a utility liner carrying immigrants, clergy, and ordinary passengers between Liverpool and Quebec. She had already completed 96 crossings. She was so ordinary that newspapers barely reported her sailings. On May 29, 1914, at 1:56 a.m., she collided with a Norwegian coal vessel in thick fog. By 10 a.m., she was gone, 14 minutes. The fog was so dense that people on the bridge couldn't see the bow. Here's the thing that breaks the logic. Empress was built with everything Titanic lacked. After the Titanic disaster, the world changed maritime law. Lifeboat requirements doubled. Watertight compartments became mandatory. Constant radio watch was enforced, and every ship built after 1912 learned these lessons. Empress of Ireland had all of it. She had enough lifeboats for every soul aboard, plus reserves. She had state-of-the-art watertight doors that could seal in seconds. She had a trained crew that knew the evacuation procedures. She had a radio operator who was awake at the moment of collision. And yet, 1,012 people died in 14 minutes. On Titanic, the disaster unfolded in slow motion, a luxury that gave time for procedure, for rescue ships to hear the distress call, for lifeboats to fill partly from the confusion. On Empress, there was no time. The collision happened. The compartments flooded, the ship listed, and before anyone could understand what was happening, the water claimed them. Titanic's sinking prompted investigations by the US Congress and the British Board of Trade. It prompted new laws. It prompted international maritime conferences. The world asked, how could this happen? What do we need to change? Empress's sinking prompted local inquiries and nothing more. Because 1 month after her death, on June 28, 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated in Sarajevo. Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia, and the world's attention pivoted to a far larger catastrophe. Empress of Ireland didn't just lose a narrative battle. She was buried by history itself. But before we let her slip away entirely, consider this. Of the 138 children aboard Empress of Ireland, only 4 survived, a 2.9% survival rate. On Titanic, 52% of children made it off the ship. Still tragic, but radically different. Why? Because Empress sank faster than the lifeboats could load. Because families on the lower decks never heard the collision, the ship rolled, the power died, and in the darkness of the cabins, parents held their children and waited for a rescue, that came only as water. This is not a story of hubris and pride, like Titanic. This is a story of a ship that did everything right and still failed. And the world decided that kind of tragedy was less worth remembering, perhaps because it asks harder questions. Next, how a ship built to survive everything became the casualty of a captain's first command and 14 minutes in the fog. The Empress of Ireland entered the world on a cold January morning in 1906, not with fanfare, but with purpose. She was born at Fairfield Shipbuilding and Engineering in Govan, Scotland, on Yard 442, built alongside her identical sister, Empress of Britain. Both ships were designed by Francis Elgar, a naval architect who understood the practical business of moving people across oceans. She wasn't built to be the biggest or the fastest. She was built to be the most efficient and, crucially, the safest. Empress was 570 feet long, with a beam of 65.72 feet. But the real revolution wasn't in size, it was in safety. By 1906, the maritime world had learned nothing from the future. Titanic wouldn't sink until 1912, yet Empress was already being built with features that Titanic would later be celebrated for lacking. Empress had a double-bottom hull that ran the entire length of the ship, 2 layers of steel to absorb the shock of collision. She had 11 watertight compartments, each sealed by watertight doors. Her designers calculated that she could survive with 2 adjacent compartments flooded and remain afloat. Compare that to Titanic, which had a design that could only survive 1 or 2 adjacent compartments open to the sea, the exact configuration that killed her when she struck the iceberg. But here's the crucial detail. On Titanic, the watertight doors could be closed electronically from the bridge. On Empress, they had to be closed manually, by crew members running through the ship, hand cranking each door shut. Empress also had enough lifeboats, not just to meet requirements, but to exceed them. She had more wooden davits and collapsible boats than she strictly needed. On paper, she was unsinkable, or at least much safer than her competitors. The Empress of Ireland was not a glamorous ship. She wasn't the Mauritania breaking speed records. She wasn't the Olympic, sister to the Titanic. She was what one observer called comfortable and inviting, a working ship designed to haul immigrants, clergy, businessmen, and ordinary people between Britain and Canada. Her first-class accommodations were pleasant, but not palatial. Her second-class rooms were spacious and welcoming, a dramatic improvement over what second-class passengers usually received. Her third-class and steerage quarters, once the domain of the miserable, were now clean, well-lit cabins with proper furniture. For the first time on a major ocean liner, third-class passengers weren't packed into the bowels like cargo. They had promenade access, they had smoking rooms with pianos. They had dining rooms that could seat 300 at a single serving. The Empress of Ireland embodied a radical idea, that ordinary people deserved dignity when they crossed the sea. From June 29, 1906, she became the backbone of Canadian Pacific's transatlantic service. For 8 years, she made the Liverpool to Quebec run with monotonous reliability. Departure at 4:30 p.m., a week at sea. Arrival in Quebec City, 570 miles upriver from the Atlantic. By 1914, she had completed 96 voyages, 96 uneventful crossings, each one adding to a reputation for safety and dependability. Then came May 1914. Captain Henry George Kendall was appointed to the Empress of Ireland. Kendall was not a novice. Born in 1874, he was a veteran of 30 years at sea, rising through the ranks of the Royal Navy Reserve until he earned his first command in 1908. His most recent post had been on the Canadian Pacific SSS Montrose, where he'd become famous for using radio telegraphy to capture the murderer Dr. Holly Harvey Crippen, the first use of wireless to catch a criminal. But on May 1, 1914, when Kendall took command of the Empress of Ireland, it was his first voyage down the St. Lawrence River as captain of this particular ship. his first command of the Empress. He was promoted quickly. In late May, as the ship was being provisioned for her 96th voyage, Kendall received the appointment. The ship was ready, the passengers were boarding. The cargo was loaded, and the captain was eager to prove himself. On the afternoon of May 28, 1914, the Empress departed Quebec City, 4:30 p.m. bound for Liverpool. Aboard were 1,057 passengers, roughly two-thirds of her capacity, and a crew of 420. The passenger list was modest, only 87 first-class bookings. But there were notable figures. There were 167 members of the Salvation Army, travelling to attend a conference in London. There were families, there were workers, there were 138 children. Kendall had been warned of the prevalent fogs in the lower river. He was aware that forest fires in Quebec were throwing smoke blankets over the St. Lawrence, but he was a seasoned navigator. He took the usual precautions. By 1:30 a.m. on May 29th, the Empress had passed Father Point and dropped the pilot. The ship then proceeded at full speed down the narrowing river, heading toward the Atlantic. At 1:56 a.m., Captain Kendall sighted a slight fog bank, coming gradually from the land. The visibility was perhaps 100 meters, enough to see shapes, but not enough to judge distance or speed. Within minutes, he would make a decision that 1,012 people would not survive. Next, the fog, the collision, and the 14 minutes that broke every rule about how disasters should unfold. It was 1:38 a.m. on May 29, 1914. Captain Kendall was on the bridge of the Empress of Ireland, the river dark and the ship running at full speed toward the Atlantic. The night was clear, unusually clear for the St. Lawrence, where fog was the default condition. Then, at approximately 1:38, a lookout on the bridge spotted masthead lights on the starboard bow. Another ship, perhaps 6 miles away. Kendall could see her clearly, a Norwegian collier named SS Storsted, loaded with coal and heading upriver toward Quebec to pick up cargo. This was routine, to ships passing each other in opposite directions. The protocol was simple and understood by every captain in the world: pass starboard to starboard, green light to green light. Both ships would alter course slightly and pass safely on either side. Kendall ordered a slight alteration to his course to maintain the starboard to starboard passage. All was well. Then the fog came. It didn't roll in gradually. It came suddenly, like a curtain dropping. One moment, visibility was clear. The next, the lights of the Storsted were dimmed by a wall of mist rolling off the Canadian shore. Kendall reacted instantly. He ordered the engines stopped, full astern. He rang the ship's whistle 3 times in short blasts, the universal maritime signal. My engines are going full astern. I am backing water. This was the correct procedure. This is what the regulations required. The Storsted received the signal. On her bridge, Chief Officer Alfred Taft-Deans heard the 3 blasts clearly. He assumed it meant the Empress intended to maintain her course and pass port to port, red light to red light, the alternative safe passage. Taft-Deans did not call the captain. The Norwegian collier was a working ship, not a passenger liner. There was no sense of emergency. He simply accepted the signal as information. The other ship would pass on the opposite side. Ample room, no problem. But the fog was thickening. Visibility dropped to perhaps 100 meters, the length of a city block. The masthead lights of the Empress disappeared into the murk. The Storsted kept her course. Moments later, the fog closed completely. Both ships were now operating blind, guided only by whistle signals echoing through darkness and mist. Kendall blew to more blasts. My ship is dead in the water. Another standard signal. The Storsted responded with one long blast, acknowledgement. Then there was silence. Just the sound of the river and the fog, and the hum of engines idling. 1 minute passed, 2 minutes, 3. On the bridge of the Empress, Kendall kept his eyes fixed on the fog, waiting for the Storsted's lights to reappear. In the darkness below, the passengers slept. Most of them had retired after dinner. The ship's motion was steady, the vibration of the engines a familiar comfort. Children slept in their cabins, women in their bunks, men in the smoking room on F deck, drowsy and warm. Then Captain Kendall saw something that made his blood freeze. Masthead lights, the Storsted's lights, emerging from the fog, not where he expected them, not passing safely on the opposite side, but appearing almost at right angles to his own ship, and approaching at high speed. Kendall had perhaps 1 second to react. He screamed an order, full speed ahead, a desperate attempt to ram the Empress's bow forward and minimize the collision. But the engines of the Empress were still stopped. They couldn't generate that power in time. At 1:56 a.m., the Storsted, a 6,000-ton coal carrier, with a reinforced bow designed to break through Arctic ice, struck the Empress of Ireland's starboard side amidships with catastrophic force. The impact tore a gash in the ship's hull. Not a small opening, a massive wound, approximately 16 feet long, running from the second-class and third-class quarters. The first thing Captain Kendall did after the collision was grab a megaphone and shout directly at the Storsted, "Keep your engines full ahead. Plug the hole. Don't back away." It was a desperate improvisation. If the Storsted remained embedded in the Empress's side, its hull could act as a plug, slowing the intake of water. But it was too late. The current of the St. Lawrence was already pulling the two ships apart. The Storsted began to drift backward and sideways, and within 5 seconds, the gap widened. Water began to pour into the Empress of Ireland, 60,000 imperial gallons per second. In modern measurements, that's 270,000 liters per second. Imagine a waterfall the width of a city street, flowing into a space where people were sleeping. The scale of the disaster became immediately clear. The watertight compartments that had been designed to save the ship, designed so carefully after the Titanic, suddenly became irrelevant. The gash was too large, too low, too centrally located. Water poured through it faster than any human or mechanical system could seal it. Kendall ordered the watertight doors closed. But by the time the crew could reach them, water was already cascading through the corridors. On the lower decks, where third-class passengers slept, the water rose from ankle-deep to chest-deep in seconds. The doors could not be closed. The bulkheads were already flooded. The ship began to list to starboard, the side where the collision had occurred. It was a slow tilt at first, barely noticeable. But it accelerated, faster and faster. Furniture began to slide. Passengers in their bunks felt themselves tilting sideways. Men who had been standing suddenly found the floor tilting beneath their feet. In the engine room, the engineers recognized the death sentence immediately. The list was becoming too severe. The boilers, which had been engineered to stay level, began to tilt. Steam pipes ruptured. The dynamos shut down. Electricity died. Darkness fell. Complete darkness. The electric lights that had illuminated every corridor, every cabin, every stairwell simply ceased to exist. The emergency generators, mounted to low to resist the rising water, were already submerged. People woke up in the darkness to find their cabins tilting. Mothers grabbed their children. Men fumbled for their life jackets. On the deck above, other passengers began to climbing upward as the ship tilted, seeking the highest point they could find. 6 minutes after collision, the list had become so extreme that it was impossible to launch lifeboats from the lower davits. The boats couldn't be lowered. The list made them swing inward toward the ship. Only 5 or 6 lifeboats were successfully launched before the situation became impossible. The officers of the Empress, trained in the post-Titanic protocols, tried desperately to manage the evacuation, but there was no evacuation. There was only chaos and darkness and the sound of water rising through the corridors. 10 minutes after collision, the Empress of Ireland had rolled so far to her starboard side that she was nearly perpendicular to the water. The starboard hull was now facing almost straight up at the sky. People who had climbed to what they thought was safety, the upper decks, suddenly found themselves perched on the side of the hull, insects on a wall, One survivor would later describe it as like sitting on a beach, watching the tide come in. But it was the opposite. The tide was the ship, the water was rising, and the angle was becoming steeper. 13 minutes after collision, the bow of the Empress rose briefly out of the water, a terrible moment when the entire stern sank beneath the surface, pulling hundreds of people down with it. Those who had managed to climb onto the tilted hull suddenly found themselves above open water instead of solid ship. 14:02 a.m. 2 minutes after the initial collision, the RMS Empress of Ireland gave up. Her bow sank, her stern sank, her bridge, where Captain Kendall had stood moments before, sank beneath the cold water of the St. Lawrence River. The entire ship had disappeared in 14 minutes. What happened next was not heroic or organized. It was survival and chance. The store stood, damaged, but not crippled, remained afloat. Her crew threw lines and rescued about 200 people who had made it into the water or managed to swim. Nearby ships heard the wireless distress calls. The SS Eureka arrived first, at 3:10 a.m., and pulled about 150 survivors from the water. Many of them were already suffering from hypothermia. The river water was near freezing. A human body loses consciousness in minutes. The Lady Evelyn arrived at 3:45 a.m. and collected the survivors rescued by the Storstad to 200 people, and also recovered 133 bodies. By 5:15 a.m., the injured and survivors were being transported to Rimouski, a small town up the river, where doctors and relief supplies had been hastily assembled. By dawn, it was over. Of the 1,477 people aboard the Empress of Ireland, 465 survived, 1,012 died. Of the 138 children aboard, only 4 survived. 134 children drowned. Of the 310 women aboard, only 41 survived. 169 women drowned. The death toll exceeded the Titanic. The sinking was faster than any major maritime disaster in history, and it happened in the St. Lawrence River, so close to shore that people on the riverbank heard the screams. Next, the blame, the confusion, and the question that lingers even today. How could a ship with every safety feature fail so completely in such a small tragedy? The Canadian inquiry was swift and brutal. Presided over by Lord Mersey, the same judge who investigated Titanic, the commission heard 61 witnesses across 11 days. The verdict was clear. Chief Officer Alfred Tafdeans of the Storstad was responsible for changing course in the fog and failing to call his captain when visibility dropped. But Captain Kendall insisted he bore no blame. After boarding the Storstad, his first words to its captain were, "You have sunk my ship." He maintained this accusation for the rest of his life. However, a Norwegian counter-inquiry absolved Tafdeans entirely and blamed Kendall instead, claiming the Empress changed course first and then stopped dead, leaving the Storstad no escape route. The truth, both captains made mistakes in a fog where no visibility meant protocol was meaningless. But the inquiries accomplished nothing. Ships would continue to collide in fog for decades. Here's the tragedy within the tragedy. The Empress of Ireland did everything right and still failed. She had adequate lifeboats, unlike Titanic. She had watertight compartments. She had trained crew. She had radio, and it didn't matter. The collision was too severe, the sinking too fast, the angle too extreme. This posed a dangerous question to the maritime industry. If a properly equipped ship could still die, what did safety actually mean? The answer was uncomfortable, so the world forgot. The Salvation Army connection should have sealed the narrative. 171 Salvationists aboard, only 8 survived. The Canadian Staff Band, heading to London for an international congress, nearly ceased to exist. The organization built monuments, held annual remembrances, and never let the memory fade locally. But globally, the story was buried by 2 events. World War I, declared exactly 1 month later. Suddenly 1,012 deaths in a river seemed provincial, compared to millions dying in trenches. Titanic's cultural dominance. One disaster becomes a legend, the other becomes a footnote. The wreck itself was salvaged quickly by Canadian Pacific. They needed $150,000 in silver bullion from the cargo. Then the location was lost for 50 years. When divers rediscovered it in the 1960s, artifacts and human remains were stripped until Quebec declared it a protected site in the late 1990s. Today, the Empress sits 40 meters offshore in Rimouski, closer to the living than the Titanic ever will be. But fewer people know her name. Grace Hanagon, one of the 4 child survivors, lived until 1995. She spent her life telling the story. The last survivor of the Empress of Ireland. When she died, the living memory died with her. On Titanic, 1,500 deaths in 2 hours 40 minutes became the greatest maritime legend of all time. On Empress, 1,012 deaths in 14 minutes became Canada's forgotten tragedy. The difference wasn't the numbers. It wasn't the ship, it was the story, and who had the power to tell it. Titanic had wealth, celebrity, and a slow-motion finale that allowed time for drama. Empress had ordinary people under fog that stole their narrative before it began. She sank too fast to be legendary. She had too much safety to be instructive. She died at the wrong historical moment to be remembered. And so the RMS Empress of Ireland remains what she always was, a working ship, doing her job, carrying ordinary people, and being forgotten by a world that prefers its tragedies more theatrical.